Hey guys, it's Casey and welcome back to my channel, and welcome not to my house because this is clearly not where I live. This is actually Ash's house, but I am staying here for the foreseeable future, at least the next 2 weeks, because my friends have collectively decided that I am a danger to both myself and others and can't be left alone, and that I am scaring Nate because apparently that is the new threshold for requiring professional help around these parts. And so they have officially initiated a no Casey home alone policy for the next 2 weeks, meaning that I can only work during daylight hours 3 days a week. But that's not really working so swimmingly because I am the attending doctor of our shitty little hospital, and so they're having to slip their very underqualified shoes into my overqualified feet, or really, I guess the saying's the opposite. Whatever, fix it in your brain, I don't care. But sure, containment measures, very reassuring. But like I said, a lot has gone down over the past week, and believe it or not, it all started 12 years before I was born. So 12 years before I was born, my mother had another daughter, and her name was Adelia Rose. And apparently, according to everybody that I ever met in my city that I grew up in, Adelia Rose was the most singular, beautiful, perfect, incredible, talented child who has ever walked the face of the planet ever in all of human history. She looked like friggin' Rapunzel. That's how beautiful she was, and everybody loved Adelia Rose. But unfortunately, Adelia Rose died in a very tragic and gruesome and public manner when she was 8 years old. So long story, very, very short of what happened exactly. My grandmother was the mayor of our city. She was when Adelia Rose was born, and when she died, and when I was born, and until my grandmother died. So that was a very, very long time for her to be in power. Every single year, like clockwork, at the start of spring, my grandmother would have a huge, beautiful garden party. And she did this every single year because she had the most beautiful garden in all of the city, and everybody wanted to come and see it because it was mature, it had beautiful rose gardens, it had a secret garden, it had like giant vegetable patches that you could go through, and that they would take every single spring and they would weigh them up and put them into competitions because the vegetable and the produce was just so big and luxurious. Blue ribbon produce, or whatever you want to call it. So everybody wanted to come and see this garden and smoozy up to the mayor. The year that Adelia turned 8, spring came around, and my grandmother was less than thrilled because my grandmother that year had commissioned the building of a new greenhouse for her garden, specifically for her rose bushes. And the commissioned greenhouse was not finished as had been intended by the time the weekend of the party rolled around. So my grandmother was very, very disappointed and displeased, and she probably made that known to the construction crew. So they left a big mess. They were going to come back and finish it, but that day of the garden party, they did not clean up as well as they should have. And one way that they did not clean up as well as they should have is that they left a big sheet of commercial glass hanging from a pulley on a crane. So it was just hanging there above the trenches that they had dug out and put all the stakes in, where they were going to put the glass down in order to form the greenhouse. Now, it needs to be stated that my grandmother knew that that plane of glass was there, and the construction crew workers had told her that they needed to move the plane of glass. But my grandmother's like, no, you've had your time. I need to set up for my party. That's not going to happen. And so they left the plane of glass hanging there over this trench, and they covered the trench with a plank of wood so that people could see where it was and they wouldn't fall into it, which is one step further than I would have done if my very, very mean grandmother, because she was a very mean lady when she wanted to be and when she was displeased with something, was sitting there screaming explicit insults at me. But good on them, they did what they had to do. Now, when you are a child, and I can speak to this from personal experience of having attended her garden parties when I was a child, when you attend these parties, they are very, very extraordinarily boring to go to. So even though the children who were in attendance were told to stay away from the construction site, they still went there, and they made a game out of using the plank of wood that was covering the trenches as a balancing beam. So they would walk over it and, try to throw stuff at each other to get themselves to fall into the ditch, which I don't even know why they were doing that in the first place, because again, there were uncovered beams that were very sharp, like stake-like in the trench. I don't know why they were doing that. I wasn't there. Obviously, I was not born for another decade and a bit, so the reasoning behind why they were doing what they were doing is beyond me. What essentially happened is that there was this known little boy who was a bit of a pain in the butt. We all know the type who was a little bit of a pain in the butt, but I don't think that he can be held responsible because he was a child and it should have been up to the adults who were present at the party to supervise them, and they weren't doing that. So all the kids were playing around this trench on the construction site that they weren't supposed to be at, and they were using the plank of wood over the trench as a balancing beam. And this little boy started taunting the other kids, and because Adelia Rose was such a perfect little person, she was defending the other kids and she was mouthing off as well. And it was her turn to be going over the plank of wood. And this little boy, he took things a little bit too far and he jumped up on the piece of rope that was holding up the pane of glass and he started swinging on it, and that disturbed the rope holding the pane of glass and it fell. And because it was commercial glass and not just standard glass, it didn't shatter into tiny little pieces, it shattered into giant shards of glass that flew up. So it hit the trench, the bottom of the trench, and all the shards of glass flew up. And because in that specific moment, Adelia Rose was the one who was on the plank of wood over the trench, she took the brunt of the impact from all those giant shards of glass spraying up when they made contact with the bottom of the trench. And so she got the most injuries, and really the one that was most concerning is that she suffered something that is called a severe maxillofacial avulsion injury, which is just a nicer way of saying that it essentially, those giant shards of glass ripped off her lower jaw and almost her entire head. And so it was very graphic, it was very bloody, and it was something that was very traumatic for everyone who was in attendance to that party. And there was like 80 people there. And because it was such a public event and it was such a public freak accident is really the only word that you can use to describe it, she pretty much became a local urban legend within my city. And so even though I was born 12 years after she was born, everyone still remembered her name and what happened to her, and I had to hear about it constantly when I was growing up. And so for my entire childhood, I heard constantly about how I was second best to Adelia Rose because Adelia Rose was so perfect and so beautiful and she looked like Rapunzel, and I very much do not and did not look like Rapunzel. I looked like me, and I developed a very strong inferiority complex as a result of that. There's really no other way to describe it. I spent my entire life from about the age of 4 into I was an adult, thinking that I was the most hideous person who had ever walked the face of the planet, the most unlikable, the most unlovable person, because I was not Adelia Rose. Not from my mother though, I need to put that out there. I did not hear anything about this from my mother because from her perspective, Adelia Rose was not my sister and she was barely even my mother's daughter, even though biologically she was, because my mother gave birth to Adelia Rose when she was 16, and she and my grandmother had a very complicated relationship, and my mother wanted to give and had planned to give Adelia Rose up for adoption because she was not ready to raise a baby. But she gave birth to Adelia Rose in my grandmother's house, and then she went to bed thinking that was the end of it. Like, she was a bit sad to see her off, but she knew that Adelia Rose was going to a better place than what she could provide her with. But she woke up in the morning to the confinement nurse, because where we lived, we practiced postnatal confinement, bringing the baby into her bedroom and pretty much forcing my mother to breastfeed her. And she told my mother that Adelia's name was Adelia Rose because my grandmother had named the baby in her stead. And so Adelia Rose was really my grandmother's baby more than my mother's, even though it was never hidden from anyone that Adelia Rose was my mother's child. And my mother told me many, many times whenever it was brought up that even though in her own way, she did love Adelia Rose as her child, she did feel a lot of relief when Adelia Rose died as well. Like, she felt a lot of sorrow, she felt a lot of grief, she felt very distraught and destroyed by her death, but also a lot of relief that she was, free from my grandmother's grasp. She had no reason to remain in my grandmother's house anymore, because at that point in time, Adelia Rose died when she was 8. My mother had barely left the house. She trained as a doctor under my grandfather, who was also a doctor. And then once Adelia Rose left, she was able to leave, and she left straight after Adelia Rose's funeral and went to a different country where she was able to practice her medicine and become very, very good at it. by the time my mother died, she was very well renowned as a medical professional. She had won awards and she had taught so many students, and she was tenured as a head of medicine at a world-renowned university. Like, she was very, very good at what she did, and had Adelia Rose not died, she wouldn't have been able to do that. So my mother had that sense of relief, which sounds terrible, but it's true. And had that not happened, I wouldn't have been born. And when I was born, my mother was in a much better position to be a mother. And she was a fantastic mother. She took in many children that we picked up, many strays that we picked up along the way over the years. And she was great at what she did. So even though I never heard any of that from my mother, I heard it from literally everybody else that I was surrounded by. And so I grew up with a lot of people looking at me with pity and, would whisper whenever I came around, and a lot of old women would like pat me on the head and tell me that it was all right. And I interpreted that as me just, again, being super ugly, me not being as good as Adelia Rose, and just not being enough. And that impacted me tremendously growing up and into my adulthood. And I carried that with me for a very, very long time. And I hated Adelia Rose. I still am not fond of her memory to this day, which is okay because I don't have much reason these days to remember her. Adelia Rose became the ghost who haunted my narrative, the fixed point whom I was always compared to and lost against, because you cannot compete against a dead perfect child with blonde hair. And I then took that poison into my marriage because I would try to pick fights with my husband all the time and try to force him to say that I was ugly, which, was not difficult for me to do because he was so objectively gorgeous, and my best friend was also objectively gorgeous. And you're probably wondering how those two things are connected. Well, they're connected because my marriage was essentially just a lavender marriage where my best friend and my husband were in a smegdual relationship together, and I was essentially their beard. And so the fact that the two of them were so physically beautiful just made me feel even more inferior than I already felt from growing up in Adelia Rose's shadow. And so I would always try to test my husband and pick a fight, and it got really, really bad, especially after my daughter was born and she was a baby, because I would be like, well, she looks like me, and so she's ugly. Isn't she ugly? You think she's ugly. And my husband, as well as being physically stunning, was also incredibly emotionally intelligent, so he never rose to the bait, which would then make me even more angry, because then I would start fighting with him about, well, he should be defending our daughter against me when I call her ugly because she's not ugly and he's such a horrible father. It was a real lose-lose situation, and I did that for years and years and years. Not always that specific conversation, but those kind of tests that he just couldn't win. There was no winning move for him to make, and bless him, he sucked it up like a sponge and he never complained about it, which is probably what I needed at that point in time. Which brings me forward to this week and me having an emotional breakdown, essentially, because I saw photos of myself for the first time since being here, and I was like, oh my god, I forgot what I looked like in real life, and I was so beautiful. I was so stunning, and that devastated me because I never got to live in that reality. I only got to live in the one where I was ugly and lesser than and not deserving of anything because I was so hideous that no one could ever like me or look at me. The worst part about it, the worst singular worst part about it is that I got these photos. I got a lot of photos. I got photos of me. I got photos of my daughter because I have not had photos of my daughter really ever since we separated paths. So I have only ever had a singular photo of her in a frame from the day that she was born. But Drest let me have access finally to his photos. And so I was flipping through them and he called me up while I was doing so, and I was hysterical and mid-ugly crying, and I was like, oh my god, I'm on the phone, oh my god, I was so beautiful, why did nobody tell me I was so beautiful at the time? Like, I want to be that, I want to look like that now, I would be the most hottest person you've ever seen in your entire life, why can't that be me today? And it was like a confession and a eulogy all in one. And this crazy bastard, and this is how you know he is a legitimate psychopath, he listens to me cry into his ear, making the most heartfelt confession filled with sorrow and grief and regret, and he listens to me cry into his ear for about 10 minutes straight, and then he says to me, matter of fact, as if he is reporting on the weather, that I could still look like that today if I wanted to and was willing to put in the work. because the only reason that I looked like that in the first place is that Ilya and I were stuck in a waifish gothic era and we were competitively under-eating against each other. But I can't do that today because all I do is sit around and eat, and I am, and I quote, word for word, that he said into my very own ear, "You are obesity." Not, "You are obese." Not, "Casey, you've gained weight." Not, "If you're feeling that strongly and you're having this much of a reaction to seeing a photo of yourself when you were younger, you might want to consider for your own health benefits losing 5 or 10 kilos. No, nothing like that. Just simply, you are obese. Like, I am obesity conceptualized. Like, I am a governmental department dedicated to fat people. Like, they stick my face on a packet of Tim Tams as a public health warning against others. Like, what do you mean I am obesity? What am I, the patron saint of fatties? Floating through the cosmos, blessing every drive-through that I pass my way to sit on some fat guy's shoulder to whisper into his ear that he should open the fridge at 2 a.m, transversing the galaxy through the power of the cheeseburger. And that, my friends, is a teeny tiny snippet of why I have been conscripted to come and live at Ash's house for the next 2 weeks. Like I said, a very teeny tiny part, because if I was to tell the full story, it would include elements such as 3 black giant storage bins filled with my dead daughter's belongings and photos from my life that I have never seen before. If I have seen, I haven't seen in many years. It includes a haunted doll and a government caravan of black SUVs chasing me down the highway while I drive a Dodge Ram that has testicles hanging off its bell bar. So I'm trying to keep my videos shorter than they have been historically. We'll see how this video goes, and we may tell those parts of the story at a later date, just not today. But for right now, this is Casey signing off for the night. As always, stay weird out there, stay safe, and I am going to go get some tacos because Drest is not wrong about a few things, because even a broken clock is right twice a day. Good night.